Good afternoon, students. Today, in this revision session, we are going to discuss about demography, its definition, demographic cycle, and demographic trends in India. The word demography is a combination of two Greek words, demos meaning people and graphy meaning science. Thus, demography is the science of people. In the middle of the 19th century, in 1855, the where demography was first used by a French writer, Achille Gilliard. John Grant is considered as the father of demography. We know demography is the scientific study of human population. Now here is a definition of demography. Demography is the study of the size, territorial distribution and composition of population, changes therein, and the components of such changes, which may be identified as natality, mortality, territorial movement or migration, and social mobility, that is, change of status. This definition was given by Nagin and Hauser in the year 1972. From this definition, we can synthesize five processes of this demography. That processes are fertility, mortality, marriage, migration, and social mobility. So, the five processes of demography are fertility, mortality, marriage, migration, and social mobility. Next, about the demographic cycle. The history of world population since 1650 suggests that there is a demographic cycle of five stages through which a nation passes. These five stages are: the first stage, that is high stationary; the second stage, that is early expanding; the third stage, that is late expanding; the fourth stage, that is low stationary; the fifth, that is the final stage, that is stage of declining. Now, about the first stage, that is high stationary. This high stationary stage, which is characterized by high birth rate and high death rate. So, this high birth rate and high death rate which cancel each other and the population remains stationary. India was in this stage till 1920. So, the first stage, high stationary, in which the birth rate and the death rate high, and both this cancel each other and the population remains stationary. And India was in this stage till 1920. So we identified that in the first stage, that is in the high stationary stage, there is no change in the population. Now about the second stage, that is early expanding. Here the death rate begins to decline while the birth rate remains unchanged. Birth rate remains unchanged and death rate begins to decline. Death rate begins to decline and birth rate remains unchanged in the second stage, that is early expanding. Many countries of this South Asia and Africa are in this phase, and birth rates have increased in some of these countries, possibly as a result of improved health conditions and also shortening periods of breastfeeding. So, in this phase, that is in the second stage, that is in the early expanding, here death rate begins to decline while the birth rate remains unchanged. Birth rate remains unchanged and death rate begins to decline. Next, about the third stage, that is late expanding. This is very, very important. That is, India has ended this phase. In this stage, the death rate declines still further and the birth rate tends to fall. Here, the birth rate tends to fall and the death rate declines still further. So, the population continues to grow because birth exceeds death. In this third stage, here the birth exceeds death. So, the population here continues to grow because the birth rate tends to fall and the death rate declines still further. India already ended in this phase in a number of developing countries like China and Singapore. Here, birth rates have declined rapidly. So, in the late expanding stage, the population continues to grow because birth exceeds death. India has ended in this phase. Now about the fourth stage, that is the low stationary. This stage is opposite to our first stage, that is the high stationary. We know in the high stationary there was high birth rate and high death rate. In this stage, in the low stationary, there is low birth rate and low death rate. So both of this low birth rate and low death rate which cancel each other and the population becomes stationary. We know most of our industrialized countries have undergone a demographic transition shifting from a high birth and high death rates to low birth and low death rates. And the countries like Austria, UK, Denmark, Sweden, and Belgium already ended in this phase, that is in the low stationary. Here, the population is stationary because both this low birth rate and low death rate which cancel each other. About the last stage, the fifth stage, the stage of declining. Here, the birth rate is lower than the death rate. So the population begins to decline, and some of the East European countries, notably the Germany and Hungary, are experiencing this stage. Here, the birth rate is lower than the death rate, and the population begins to decline. So these are the five stages of demographic cycle, that is the high stationary, early expanding, late expanding, low stationary, and the stage of declining. In the high stationary, there was high birth rate and high death rate. India was in this stage till 1920. In the early expanding stage, the death rate begins to decline while the birth rate remains unchanged. Now, about the third stage, the late expanding. The death rate declines still further and the birth rate tends to fall. India ended this phase. In a number of developing countries like China, Singapore, the birth rates have declined rapidly. In the fourth stage, that is in the low stationary, here the low birth rate and low death rate which cancel each other and the population becomes stationary. Most of the industrialized countries already undergone this phase. Examples are Austria, UK, Denmark, Sweden, and Belgium. And the last stage, the fifth stage, here the population begins to decline because birth rate is lower than the death rate. Some of the East European countries like the Germany, Hungary are experiencing this stage. That's about the demographic cycle. Next about demographic trends. The demographic characteristics provide an overview of its population size, composition, territorial distribution, changes therein, and the components of changes such as nativity, mortality, and social mobility. So the demographic indicators have been divided into two parts. That is population statistics and the vital statistics. The population statistics include indicators that measure the population size, sex ratio, density, and dependency ratio. The vital statistics include indicators such as birth rate, death rate, natural growth rate, life expectancy at birth, mortality, and fertility rates. In the next revision class, we will discuss the demographic trends in India and we will compare this demographic trends in India and Kerala.